I want to remind us where we've been. We're reading, of course, John Shelby Spong, and his thesis is that the Gospels, and specifically the Gospel of Matthew that we're reading, was written, well, first of all, should not be read literally. That to read it thus would be what he refers to as a Gentile heresy. And the reason he says that is, if we look at the history of the church, up until about 150 of the Common Era, there was a very, very strong Jewish presence among the followers of Jesus. But with the letters of Paul and with the travels of Paul to various Gentile areas, and the popularity of what would come to be known as Christianity among the Gentiles, it wasn't long until Gentile, what we might say, or non-Jewish elements enter into the interpretation of the text. And it's these non-Jewish or Gentile elements, informed as they were by Greco-Roman philosophy, that eventually led to a more literal reading of the scriptures. But Spong wants to make the point that the Jews were very, very comfortable reading narratives symbolically. And this is true going all the way back to Genesis. I mean, there are Christians yet today who believe there was actually a guy named Abraham, and there was a guy named Isaac, and on down the line, Jacob and Joseph. But Jews in Jesus' day, as well as Jews today, at least I don't want to make a blanket statement about all Jews, but very few would have read those stories literally. They would have certainly seen the symbolic elements in those stories. And they were in many ways moral allegories, right? On faithfulness to God and turning one's back on one's faith. That whole Joseph novella is, if we look at Genesis 36 through 50, it's really a mini novel that has so many elements of fiction that we know of today, dramatic irony being probably the most prominent. Just let me remind you of that story if I could. I probably don't need to, but it will figure into our discussion today. Jacob had many sons, one of whom was his favorite, named Joseph. And because he was, the favorite, the other brothers were jealous of him. And there are actually two traditions on how he ends up where he does, found in Genesis. But, way leads on the way. His brothers put him in a well or sell him to sell him to travelers or business people coming by, and Joseph ends up in Egypt. The brothers go back and tell Jacob, the father, that Joseph was eaten by a wild beast while shepherding, and so Jacob thinks that he's dead. Well, way leads on to way even further. And before you know it, Joseph is an advisor to the Pharaoh in Egypt. He interprets dreams, and he becomes probably the right-hand man of the Pharaoh. And a famine seizes the area. And lo and behold, the sons of Jacob come down from Canaan, where they're all spread out and they have their land, and they ask for help. And it's because of Joseph's great financial and planning skills that, he's set aside grain for the Egyptians, and the Egyptians are doing quite well with food. Thank you very much. The brothers come and ask for assistance from Joseph, not remembering or not knowing that he is their brother. This eventually is the result, and it results in the brothers and the nation of Israel, we might say, because these are the progenitors of the 12 tribes, being protected and being sustained at a time when they could have easily died out. That story would have certainly been read symbolically by Jews. But I know there are many today who will say, oh, there was a guy named Joseph, and they will look for evidence that Joseph, served the Pharaoh and things like this. And this is the thing that upsets Spong so much so that I myself even find him being just a little too sarcastic at times, just being a little too wanting to twist the knife in the wound a little too much, almost reprimanding those who would try to read the Bible literally. And I'll point out instances of that as we move on. So you probably didn't need a review of that story, but it's going to figure into our discussion today. Are there any comments about where we've been, by the way? Gayleen is here. Hello, Gayleen.
And what chapter are you guys on? Because since I haven't been able to come the last couple weeks.
Well, right now we are going to be looking, thank you for reminding me. We just finished up chapter 6.
Okay.
And we're looking at chapter 7. Chapter 7 and chapter 8 is what we're going to be looking at today. And
I'm behind. I'm on 6 now, so.
Well, then you'll know that the thesis that Spong also wants to put before us is the idea that the Gospel of Matthew especially developed in a narrative fashion in the context of Jewish synagogue worship. So what we are seeing, as he says in an upcoming chapter that you haven't read yet, Gayleen, but you will, that the story of Joseph, the father of Jesus, was most likely part of a sermon that was preached in the synagogue, to those who were affirming the messianic aspect of Jesus' life. And so the Gospels, as we see, and we looked at the genealogy, chapter 1 of Matthew. We're going to look at chapter 2 today. Spong is putting these in the context of the synagogue. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking to myself, I know a lot of this stuff that he's talking about, but the thing that makes it absolutely creative and different is this thesis that I just mentioned, that, it wasn't a guy named Matthew or a group of people under the name Matthew who are just writing this, in a general Palestinian context. No, it was part of synagogue worship and played a role in synagogue worship. They saw Jesus as a reformer of the Jewish religion. And so if Jesus was a Messiah who was that kind of reformer, then their worship must also be reformed. And so what the Gospel of Matthew ends up being is a reformed approach to synagogue worship that by 150 of the Common Era would have died out, because Gentile Christianity would have basically, well, quite frankly, beginning in about 150, Gentile Christianity looks at the Jewish Christianity that is the source of this as being heretical. It won't be long until what we will call Jewish Christians are seen as being outliers. A great irony, unfortunately. So, are there any other comments about this? Well, last time we looked at the genealogy, and I just want to remind you of how these women played a role. Matthew gave a genealogy in good Jewish fashion, but he dropped in little aspects to the story that were unless you're reading very carefully, you can just easily gloss over. But he makes mention of Tamar, of Rahab, of Ruth, and of Bathsheba, all women who were, let's say, not as upstanding. The prostitutes, seducers, all of those things that we try to stay away from. But in saying this and in introducing these women, Spong says that Matthew wants to indicate that God can take something, a bad situation, as we've seen symbolically in the Hebrew scriptures, and turn it to something good. And this is why we see the names of these women appearing. I wanted to mention also an artist that I find more and more fascinating all the time. In fact, there was a great article in the New Yorker, I think it was around October of 2020. I'll find it if anyone's interested, on this woman, Artemisia Genderless was her name, painted in the style of Caravaggio, but she lived in the middle up till about 1659 or so. But a lot of her paintings, in fact, she painted this David and Bathsheba scene in various renditions at least 20 times. And she's also famous for something that Caravaggio did was Judith cutting off the head of Holofernes, for example. So she really brings an insight into the women of the Bible that wasn't, that offered a new perspective in the 17th century. And she's one of the only female painters that we know of. I mean, when you think of the great classic painters, Rembrandt, or Da Vinci or whatever, you don't have very many women in there. So, knowing about Gentileschi is, I think, really interesting if you have an interest in, let's see, what we might say a proto-feminist perspective on scripture. So,
Dan?
Yes, please.
Totally irrelevant, but I know a funny story about, Joseph and Potiphar's wife.
Yes.
My brother was teaching a class of grade school boys, and the verse, come lie with me, he wasn't sure how he could explain it. But the boys seemed to think that what she meant was, come tell lies with me. And so he just did not disabuse them of that notion. So that was how he handled it.
Well, that it kind of works, doesn't it? Given the story, yeah. If you know how that story works, and of course, and so, Joseph being the model of virtue, Potiphar wants to sleep with him, and he, he refuses her, and of course, then she tells lies about, and thus Joseph ends up back in prison once again. So, well, let's move on then to, speaking of Joseph, to our chapter now, and just so you're with me, we're on chapter 7. And remember the context, we're on chapter 7, but we're now going to move on to the second chapter of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. Remember how the Gospels were written. Mark was written first around 70 of the Common Era, and Mark did not have any kind of birth story. Mark begins his gospel with Jesus at about age 28, 29, 30, whatever he was, and his baptism with John the Baptist, So prior to this time, we know nothing about Jesus. Spong's thesis is that Mark also had this synagogue context in mind, but he did not make it complete. And so what Matthew tries to do is complete the synagogue worship cycle by starting from the beginning with the birth of Jesus. And so he's going to try to demonstrate how these stories are going to fit into the synagogue worship cycle. So when we look at Genesis chapter 2, when we look at Matthew chapter 2, which is kind of like Genesis chapter 2 in some ways, and because there's a birth story and a creation story. But when we look at this, it's all of the familiar things that we know about the Christmas story. I do want to point out that there are two birth stories that are relatively different. When we look at Matthew, it has a very, very Jewish context. This is the story about the star that appears before the wise men. And they follow it. They come to Herod, and Herod's diviners try to figure out where the next king would be born. Bethlehem is where that is. And they bring gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Then they go on their way. not returning to Herod to tell him where the child was born. So Herod does find out eventually where the child is born, and he orders the murder of every child in Bethlehem under the age of 2. And this is the story we're looking at today in Matthew. But this story is quite different in Luke. You might notice in this story, there were no shepherds, there were no angels, there are no shepherds guarding their flocks by night. There's no manger where Jesus is lying in the hay among the animals. Jesus is found by the Magi in a house in Matthew. So the two stories in our Christmas pageants often become conflated, and it's difficult to really parse them apart. But the reason they're different is because of what we've been saying. Matthew wants to emphasize certain things about the birth story of Jesus that Luke is going to try to develop for his own context. Matthew is writing for Jewish Christians. Luke is writing for Gentile Christians. And Jesus being born amongst the poor and the lowly serves the purposes of Luke. Jesus being born and under great cosmic events with kings arriving with gifts serves Matthew's purposes. Part of that story is a man by the name of Joseph. Now, remember, in our previous discussion, the suggestion was made by Spong that there are indications in the Bible that Jesus may have been low born, by which we mean he may have been born of Mary, who did not have a husband, he was born out of wedlock. We know this because in Mark, Jesus is referred to as Mary's son, which would be out of character for the first century for somebody to refer to anybody, the son of anyone, as the son of the wife or son of the mother, unless there was no father. So Spong makes that point, and this was the context, and we talked about Tamar, and we talked about the women in the genealogy, and the importance of saying, if there was low birth here, then it doesn't matter, because look at the stories of those sordid stories that we know about in the Hebrew Bible that God can transform. So, but Matthew does not want to leave the question open. He wants to introduce a father into the account. Now, this creates historical problems, because if we know how the New Testament, I should say, was written, the letters of Paul were written somewhere between 51 and 62 to 63 of the Common Era. Paul makes no mention of Jesus, or excuse me, of Jesus, sorry, Joseph, excuse me for that slip. Paul makes no mention of Joseph. Mark, written in 70 of the Common Era, makes no mention of Joseph. It's only in 85 of the Common Era, a good 50 years after Jesus is crucified, that that Joseph, as the father of Jesus, is mentioned. And Spong wants to point out that this is curious. There are certain legends that go around the life of Joseph, because we don't hear much about him afterwards. In Luke, we know that Joseph and Mary go down to Jerusalem when Jesus is a young boy, but by the time Jesus is, doing his ministry, by the time he's 30 years old, Joseph is long gone. He's nowhere to be seen. There's no mention of him whatsoever. So naturally, people who want to try to explain this say, will make up explanations like, well, Joseph must have been older, or Joseph must have died, when Jesus was in his youth. And over time, it became important to try to establish that as a fact, because questions were being raised. Well, where was this guy, this Saint Joseph, as he would later come to be called, in Jesus' life? And this was one of the questions that gave rise to a gospel. And we all know that there are 4 gospels in the New Testament, but at last count, there are about 26 gospels about the life and ministry and death and resurrection of Jesus, about 26 total that were written. They include the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth. And then there are these really interesting Gospels that purport to come from the brothers of Jesus. Remember, Jesus has brothers and sisters. We know this from the Gospels. One of those brothers is named James and would later lead the church in Jerusalem. He was known as James the Just. Another brother was named Thomas, Thomas Didymus, Thomas the twin. Each of them, to each of them is attributed a gospel that tries to explain some of the life of early Jesus. Because what Matthew doesn't realize he's doing when he introduces the story of Jesus' birth, and then we skip all the way to Jesus as a young man, roughly 30 years. What do you suppose people are going to ask about that 30-year period of time? Well, what was he doing in between then? Tell us stories about what Jesus was like when he was 12 or 15. And there's 2 proto-gospels, as they're called, one of them by James and one of them by Thomas. And Thomas is the most interesting because apparently, according to Thomas, Jesus was a little hellion, shooting down his friends for the slightest things, resurrecting them whenever he needed to, and doing all kinds of magician's tricks and things. And of course, putting it to the rabbis who are trying to teach him into kindergarten or wherever. That's the story in the Gospel of Thomas, or I should say the proto-evangelium of Thomas. Don't confuse it with the Gospel of Thomas. But the other more interesting proto-evangelium, proto-gospel is the one that Spong refers to, and that's the proto-evangelium of James. Scholars have determined it was probably written somewhere around 115 of the Common Era, trying to explain this introduction of Joseph and Mary into the Matthew story. So Matthew introduces this as a sermon, you might say, to the synagogue, and they may be repeating it on a yearly cycle, right? Until somebody comes up and says, well, how did all this happen? Tell us about how Joseph and Mary met. What was their first date like? Was it at the malt shop or whatever? and this Gospel of James develops this fantastic, and I mean that in every sense of the word, story about Mary, who was raised by women who were dedicated to the temple. And Mary at an early age was taken to the temple, and where she was employed as a seamstress. And the story later develops is that she was the seamstress who was responsible for sewing the veil between the Holy of Holies and the court of the priests in the temple. That's the veil that was torn in half upon the crucifixion of Christ. This is all legend, right? It was Mary who was responsible for that until Mary comes to the age of 12 or so. She reaches puberty, and at the age of 12, and you are now recognized as a woman, you have to have a protector, and it's either your father or it's your husband. Mary, we're told, did not have a father. There's no, the absent father is a kind of a recurring theme here. There's no father to speak of, right? And so the decision is made that Mary needs to be married, because, this is just the way it is. She needs a protector, but she needs to be married to somebody who recognizes that she is going to be the vessel of the Messiah. This can't be, some 20-year-old guy that's looking to start a family. This needs to be a holy man who recognizes her special calling. So a call goes out, and the men show up at the temple, and there are many suitors there, but there's Joseph in the back with his staff. And the story goes that a dove alights on Joseph, and out of his staff grow flowers like Easter lilies that indicate that he is the man and to be Mary's husband. Joseph at the time is older. He already has children, according to the story. He already has children. Mary is going to become his wife, and he is not going to be a father in the traditional sense or a husband in the traditional sense to Mary, but is going to be her protector. This is the story that Spong wants to make sure we know about as he talks about the symbolic presence of this man Joseph in the Gospels. So I've done a lot of talking. Let me stop and see if there's anything I can clarify about this.
It's all new to me because, my biblical studies, this is the most I've heard of those other gospels, those other versions of it.
Well, yeah, the other gospels are really interesting to read, but there's one called I can't remember the name of it, but some of them are Gnostic gospels, which is something that we could talk about at some other time. Others are very similar. For example, the Gospel of Thomas, roughly 70% of the Gospel of Thomas is found in the Gospel of Mark. So,
I think that's the only one I'd heard of, really, was the Gospel of Thomas. Right?
I'm sorry, what was that, Dwight? I didn't hear you.
I think the Gospel of Thomas is the only one I've ever heard of before.
Right, and that has recently become popularly read just in the last 30 years or so. This is a result of the Jesus Seminar, people making these gospels known. Back to Spong on this. Spong wants to make it clear, as he does in no uncertain terms, Joseph did not exist. Now, if you want to read it literally, you're going to insist that Joseph existed, but Joseph does not need to play an actual realistic role in this. He needs to be recognized by those hearing the story of Jesus in the synagogue as the symbolic character that he is. And this is where, Denny and I were talking about this on Sunday. Knowledge of the Jewish tradition is so important, and we're all lacking in this area. But if we read our Old Testament, and we know especially some of those stories in Genesis, it can become quite enriching to understand the symbolic nature of Joseph in this. Let's also remember that there are expectations of a Messiah and what a Messiah should be that were very prevalent in the synagogues, especially around Jerusalem and the outlying areas there. And part of what Matthew wants to do is make the case that Jesus fulfills some of the expectations of what this Messiah is going to look like. But to try to establish Joseph as an actual entity is not what Matthew's all about. What Matthew wants to do is to place the presence of Joseph in the messianic context, so that people hearing the story of the birth of Jesus with Joseph as the father, Jesus the son of Judah, right, from the line of David, Joseph being a father here is going to pique the curiosity and the imagination of people who are expecting a Messiah that has been informed by Jewish tradition. And that's what I'd like to talk about here. So any questions or comments about that?
Dan?
Yeah.
lovely painting, but Joseph is in that painting, what, 81 years old? No,
I don't, yeah, pretty
Yes.
much. But I mean, that's why I chose this, because this is the story. This explains so much, right? Well, if he's older, you know, when Jesus, his family is called, right? And because Jesus is beside himself in Mark, Joseph is nowhere to be found. When Jesus is referred to as the son of Mary, we can easily say, well, Joseph must have died by this time. And this story from the proto-evangelium of James explains a lot of this, right? Oh, Joseph is out of the picture because of the, you know, the divinely sanctioned role that he had as an elder protector of Mary until the Messiah comes into the world. And it also explains how Jesus had brothers and sisters, because they were his half brothers and sisters through Joseph, right? So Joseph already had a family when he was married to Mary. And so Jesus comes in and is not technically related to Joseph biologically, and not biologically related to his brothers and sisters. But in Mark, we can explain those brothers and sisters by the story of the old Joseph with grown children. Does that make sense?
yes, but in the quiet years, you know, given Jewish culture and the expectations of a father patriarch in the family, one wonders how this whole story played in the synagogue for all those years. I mean, where is the father figure?
Yes, right. Well, this was the difficulty people had, and you know, trying, because if what Spong says is true, one of the things that was keeping many people from recognizing Jesus as the Messiah was this possible low birth that he had from a woman. And then later this gets developed into Jewish propaganda that he was the illegitimate son of a Roman soldier and a prostitute, Mary, right? We don't know any of this early on, but Matthew is trying to address that very problem. And he's doing it in this symbolic way. And he does it in a way that is going to really have a lot of staying power, because we still recognize this story. So what role does Joseph play in Jewish history? Well, the name itself should, you know, ring some bells. Beginning in Genesis chapter 9, you probably know the story about Jacob, the son of, and not exactly the upright son. Remember, Jacob's the guy who steals his birthright from his brother Esau. Yet another example of how God can bring something good out of something not so good, right? Jacob steals his birthright from Esau. Jacob is sent to his relative Laban, who I think is Abraham's, or excuse me, is related. I can't remember what their relationship is. And there falls in love with a woman named Rachel. And Laban says, hey, well, you know, you worked for me 7 years and I'll let you marry Rachel. So Jacob does. But when the 7 years are over, Laban says, no, I'm going to give you my daughter Leah. If you really want Rachel, you're going to have to work for another 7 years. So Jacob does this. Eventually, he has both women as wives, and it's through the first wife, Leah, that the brother Judah is born. And it's through the second wife, Rachel, that the brother Joseph was born. And this is where we enter the story of the 12 brothers. And then there's Joseph, whom Jacob loved best, and he's sold into Egypt and eventually becomes the protector as well as the savior of the Israelites, through his, being the advisor to the Pharaoh. Yeah. And so this would have been, when you hear the name Joseph, this would have been the story that people in the synagogues would have heard. Joseph is a pretty prominent name in the Hebrew Bible. Well, those 12 brothers, remember, are also the progenitors of the so-called 12 tribes of Israel. 10 of those tribes can trace their lineage back to Judah. Excuse me, I should say this. 10 of those tribes, I'm sorry, I'm messing up here. I can't remember all of the tribes here, so I'm not going to say anything about that. But eventually, these 12 tribes become the foundation of the nation of Israel, that David is able to confederate under his kingship. So you have the tribe of Judah, the tribe of Issachar, the tribe of Zebulun, the tribe of Dan, and all of those tribes. They're unified under David, and this would have been about 1,000 before the Common Era. And then they really come to prominence under King Solomon, who died in about 922. But Solomon had a son named Rehoboam, who continued a lot of policies that really upset 10 of the tribes in the north. And as a result of his excesses, Rehoboam's excesses, those 10 tribes in the north break away from 2 tribes in the south. And now we have a division of the tribes into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And it's going to be over a period of about 200 years, from 922 to 722, that these tribes are going to be in a relative conflict with each other. Eventually, the 10 tribes of the north were going to fall to the Assyrians, and they would disappear altogether. Now, why this is important is, A, this would have been in the minds of every Jew in Jesus' time. They would have known the history and the conflict between Joseph and Judah, between the 10 tribes in the north and the 2 tribes in the south. They would have known that the 10 tribes in the north were now dispersed and gone, destroyed by the Assyrians. But they also would have known the messianic idea that when the Messiah comes, these 12 tribes would be joined together once again. This is the hope of the messianic ideal in the time of Jesus, that the glory of Solomon, the glory of David, when the 12 tribes were united, would once again hold itself to be true. Not only that, those 12 tribes would form the nucleus of a larger unification of all the nations. As we see in Isaiah, all of the nations will come to Jerusalem and there stand in the word of the Lord and be righteous before God. The unification of all the nations of the world, with the 12 tribes at the center, of course. And we see this in Isaiah chapter 2 and in Micah as well. On that day, the mountain of the Lord, all the nations will flock to it, and they will hear the word of God. This is what the Messiah is going to do. Any comments about that? Well, knowing that history.
Oh,
Yeah,
Dan,
go ahead, Ann.
I do
Yeah.
have one sort of pretty much irrelevant question and comment, and this is about Joseph.
Mhm.
Now, is this the same Saint Joseph who in the Catholic Church is like a patron of healing? Do you know?
Yes, I think so.
Okay,
Yes.
because I think that the hospital at Creighton is Saint Joseph's Hospital.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And yeah, I haven't been there often, but that was
Well,
that was what I was thinking.
Yeah. Thankfully, you haven't been in any hospitals very often. So
It's true. It's very true.
So,
Dan,
yeah,
have
go
a
ahead.
why was the Apocrypha not included in the canon?
Well, first of all, the Apocrypha being those books that were
Those-
written between roughly 400 before the Common Era and 200 of the Common Era. But they were mostly written in Greek because of the the Greek context in which Jews were living at that time.
Mhm.
They are included in the Roman Catholic
Yeah,
canon,
I know that. Mhm.
but because the reformers did not feel that they were divinely inspired, that they offered anything of divine inspiration, and they, first of all, they were written in Greek and not in Hebrew, which is the language of God, the language of the Hebrew Bible. They were excluded from the canon.
Mhm.
A lot of this may have to do with some of the ways that Roman Catholic practice justified itself by appeals to books of the Apocrypha. And
Mhm.
I can't think of anything right off the top of my head right now. I wish I could. But it was not included in the canon. So when people say, well, the Bible says this, the first question you should bring to the front is this: say, well, what Bible are we talking about? Are you talking about the one that has Tobit in it, and
Mhm.
first and second Esdras, and all of those? And the reformers in the 16th century, from which we derive our denomination, of course, just felt like these were not divinely inspired books, divinely inspired texts. So thank you for that.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Well, hearing, now let's bring ourselves back to the synagogue, and let's bring ourselves back to the story, this sermon, we might say, on that we would be hearing in the early Sabbaths after the Passover. This is our context. What does the introduction of somebody named Joseph as the father of Jesus, what does it suggest about, what does it suggest symbolically about Jesus as the Messiah? And this is where we can look to some of the details, as Spong does, of Joseph's character. In Matthew's genealogy, remember what we just read in Matthew chapter 1. In Matthew's genealogy, it says very clearly that Joseph's father was named Jacob. So that's kind of and we're talking about Joseph, the father of Jesus here, not the original Joseph. But making that connection there would have been the first clue. Oh, here we go, Joseph and Jacob. I'm remembering now the Genesis story. If you read Luke, that genealogy is different. Joseph's father is named Heli, or it may be Heli. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. I'm gonna have to look at the Hebrew or the Greek on that. But it's a different name altogether. And this is because Luke traces Jesus' genealogy through his mother, through Mary, which creates other problems as well, because we've just heard that we don't know who Mary's father was from the proto-evangelium of James. This is Joseph, who is spoken to in dreams, right? The angel appears to Joseph, does not appear to Mary, and tells her, blessed are you among all women, but appears to Joseph in a dream. Appears to Joseph saying, the woman will be with child and he will be the savior, he'll be the Messiah. Not only that, when the child is born, that angel appears in a dream, or Joseph is told in a dream not to go back to his home of Nazareth. And because of what Herod has found out. I think I earlier referred to that as Bethlehem, but it is Nazareth that we're talking about there. And so Joseph, as in Genesis, the Joseph interpreter of dreams is once again connected with Joseph. And Joseph here, because of this dream, because he's able to save Jesus and Mary by going into Egypt, is the protector, as well as the savior, you might say, of the child of promise. As Joseph in Genesis saved the people of Israel through his work as the advisor to Pharaoh and giving them the food they needed, so does Joseph save the new nation of Israel, so to speak, the new covenant community, through his work of bringing Jesus into Egypt for a sojourn there, so that he's not killed by Herod. all of these things, Spong suggests, would have been very evident symbolically to the people of the synagogue hearing the story. So I want to read the quote that I think really brings a lot of this together. It's on page 85 here. Look what happens also, though. Jesus is the son of David of the tribe of Judah. Joseph, his father, is the protector of this son of David. Symbolically, these two brothers, 10 tribes and 2 tribes of the past, are brought together in this divine plan, which fulfills a messianic expectation, doesn't it? That the tribes will be reunited. This is what people symbolically would be hearing upon hearing this gospel. So one of the Messiah's roles, I'm quoting now, in Jewish history was to bring the children of Israel back together into a single nation. How better could Matthew symbolize that than to suggest that even though the Messiah was a member of the tribe of Judah, he had been protected and legitimized by a man named Joseph, and thus the 2 Jewish patriarchs were united in Jesus. Then moving on to page 88, Joseph was a literary character created by Matthew to symbolize the messianic task of binding the Jewish nation into one united people by bringing together the divided tribes of the Hebrew people in the birth of Jesus. This is the profoundly Jewish character of this gospel, this story, the profoundly hopeful aspect of this story as well. And this, according to Spong, is what Jewish believers in Jesus, Jewish Christians in the synagogue would have been hearing. The last thing on their mind would have been, oh, so, there was an actual guy named Joseph right here. That wasn't important to them. That's important to us after about 150 of the Common Era. So that concludes chapter 7 for us. Are there any questions or comments about this? And if this isn't clear, please let me know, because I can.
Hey, Dan.
Yeah. Go ahead, Al.
Question about I don't know how you'd call it, maybe part of Jewish culture. I don't know if this is a modern definition or not, but I've heard that if you could be defined a Jew if your mother was Jewish.
Yes, that's
Would
true.
that be true during this period of time too, or was that something that came around later?
I really don't know, Al. And here, I wish I did, but one of the reasons that's the case, and it's kind of vulgar, unfortunately, is that it's only the mother who knows the true father, right? Of the child. A father can say, yes, this is my child. And sometimes, like, for example, my dad knows I'm his child because I look just like him and I act just like him, right? But if there's ever any doubt, it's the woman who has the last say in this, like, oh yes, you are certainly the father of the child. So that may be part of and I'm trying to think of a story, and I know there's a story in the Bible where this is prominent, where this is a part of the story, and it's not coming to me right now. But yes, even today, if you want to claim Jewish heritage, your mother needs to be Jewish. So, any other points of interest? We can.
One problem I have with reading the Bible is that I mesh all 4 Gospels into one narrative.
Right.
And to see somebody take one gospel and make a thesis out of it makes such good sense, but it's something I don't think I've ever done. is I've always overlaid the different narratives on top of each other and tried to make sense out of all of them together. But this
Right.
Dividing it out singularly and going one gospel at a time makes good sense on good reading.
And this is what the historical critical method, though it's been around for a while, it's only become part of popular Christianity, if I can say that, and not all of popular Christianity, even a small slice of it. For the last 30 or 40 years or so, what's nice about it is that it sometimes helps us to explain things that otherwise would be inexplicable. For example, as we will learn in our Sunday school class coming up this week, in a few days, there are 2 dates on which Jesus is crucified. If you read the Gospel of John, he's crucified on the day before Passover. It's called the Day of Preparation. If you read the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he's crucified on the day of Passover itself. And so, how do you, if you're a literalist, how do you explain that? And whenever I have a conversation, when I just get fed up, I have to throw that one out to my literalist friend or opponent or whomever. And the mental gymnastics that they go through to try to explain that is, well, there were two Jewish calendars at the time when in fact they were the same day. And it's like, no, just read the text. It's like, there's a difference between the day of preparation, the day of Passover, and which one was it? The only way you can reconcile that is to understand that each of these authors had a very symbolic intent. And we can explain it. We can explain that passage symbolically by referring to John's audience and referring to John's intent, theological intent, in wanting to portray Jesus as the Messiah, who is the Paschal Lamb himself. And that's what we're doing here. And I really like what Spong is doing. And I have to say, a lot of this is, this is standard introduction to New Testament. Everything that we're learning in terms of the interpretation of these texts, what's different about it is putting it in the synagogue, the Jewish synagogue, and making it part of a new liturgy in the synagogue that, would have been, hearing the story for the first time around 85 or thereabouts of the Common Era, trying to come up with a new way to worship and to affirm the Messiah in the worship of the synagogue itself. Not trying to start a whole new, eventually a lot of them would be kicked out of the synagogue because they became too controversial. And that was really the downfall of the Jewish Christian movement, is, being untethered from the synagogue itself. And the more I read Spong, the more I realize just how tragic that really was. I like to refer to Mac on this because he introduced us to this book. Do you have anything to offer with respect to this, Mac? I mean, because this is quite a book.
Yeah, it is. I really liked it. We kind of read these books out of order. I know that this group, I don't know how many were in it and or even how long ago it was. And I'm pretty sure John Harrington led it, because I have the book and his notes fell out of it when I was referring to it the other day, which is actually, even though he says this is going to be, his actual last book is called Unbelievable. I don't know how many people remember that the group read that, but this shows Spong is, and this relates very much to it, because even though he's very radical and is perceived that way, at least, he's also wants to preserve the church. And his theory in that book was, unless we make it coherent in this day and age, we're going to lose the church. People aren't going to go along and say, you mean I got to believe that?
Yeah.
And so this is his way, I think, before that book, of saying, yeah, you can believe that if you understand it properly. And we haven't understood it properly for centuries. So it's not really your fault. But if we don't understand it properly, who's going to believe a religion that says, well, there was a star hanging there and they followed it and they found a baby, but then another gospel doesn't even mention it? That's where it's unbelievable. And the modern person is just going to reject the whole thing out of hand.
Right,
I mean,
right.
We get a different paradigm of understanding.
But by the same token, we are so immersed in the literal reading of this. I mean, maybe even some among us are just like, I can't get my head around this, you know? It's so much easier for me to understand this historically. And this guy Joseph actually existed, and he died when Jesus was young. I would bet that 4 out of 5 people we talked to on the street would reject this very thing. So while Spong is saying this is the only way we can save the church, I wonder if the church is unsavable because people don't know how to think symbolically anymore. We become so scientific. Yeah, go ahead.
Our recent friend Crosan's view was, and this is actually the view that I was trained on. I think it's almost kind of the 19th century view. We know you can't say anything historically about Jesus.
Right.
You know, there's no one was having biographies considered of them that was born in that era unless they were like a king. And so it's all symbolism like this. Crosan says the only thing we can say with reasonable certainty, and this is also controversial, is that Jesus was probably an illiterate peasant Jew, period.
Right. Yeah.
Because everything was written, all of these gospels that we're studying now, you know, they were all written after the fact, and also critically, the horse I beat, they're written from a post-resurrection point of view.
Yeah.
And so you know, where he was born in a house or a manger, you know, they didn't care about that.
Yeah.
Factual, literal issue.
Yeah. And this is where I would often try to, and this is probably a good point to stop on, but it's where I would try to caution my students not to conflate fact and truth. In our society today, we think that if something is true, it must be factual. You know, the two are the same. And I often see people misuse this all the time. Well, I want to know the truth. The truth is multivalent. It's multi-dynamic. It's dynamic. And so even though what we're reading is not factual, that does not mean it's not the truth, because it is appealing to a different facet of our understanding of ourselves as human beings. This is soul truth, you might say. It's not cognitive mind scientific fact that is often called truth, but this is the truth of the soul. This is the truth that you can't explain, but when you look at an image like the one we see on the screen, it's speaking to us in a very dynamic way that cannot be, you know, parsed out scientifically. But you can look at that, or maybe one person can, or some, and say there's something about this that speaks the truth to me. And that's what symbolism. Go ahead, Mac.
Well, there's a great line that I think it might be in the final week, the Crosan and Borg. They illustrate this.
Yeah.
And they're talking about John's gospel, and they say, Emmaus, you know, the road to Emmaus story. Emmaus never happened. Emmaus always happens.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's exactly what I would tell the students, you know, that the Adam and Eve story is not a story that actually happened. It's a story that always happens, you know. You're always making the wrong decision, you know. But
that's what we taught in English class for years and years. Only it's called allegory.
Oh, exactly. Exactly.
The whole evil way of seeing the world, and they didn't know how to see it the way we see it.
Exactly right. Well, when
there's a key phrase, and Mac, you might know, I think it was Crossan too, where he said, it may not be literally true, but it is profoundly true.
Yeah.
And so I think of that literal and profoundness.
Right, exactly. Wonderful. That's a wonderful point to end on. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll read chapter 8. I thought we'd get through chapter 8 today, but apparently I talked too much. So, but when we come back, please, if you want to review Isaiah 60, I'll give you a little context for that next time. But what I'm going to say Spong, I almost said Crossan. What Spong wants to say is that this is the real foundation of the story of the Magi. And it served as a kind of sermon, you might say, that would have been preached in the synagogue. So we'll look at chapter 8 and probably get into chapter 9 as well. Galen's not with us anymore, but Galen and Joyce, thank you again. It's nice seeing everybody in all of those wonderful places you're visiting. I'll see you all next week.
Thanks,
Okay?
Don.
All right. See you later. Bye.